right, I am very grateful to the Cystic Fibrosis Lifestyle Foundation and CFresh for inviting me to talk with you today about genetic testing and genetic counseling considerations for males with cystic fibrosis. I've been a board member of CFresh for many years, and I know the great work that they do, and I'm excited for this new partnership with the CFLF. A lofty agenda today to review CF inheritance scenarios that are relevant to males or those assigned male at birth who have cystic fibrosis, their partners, and their families. Outline a plan for conception via sperm retrieval and in vitro fertilization. Discuss current options for prenatal and preconception genetic screening and testing, including carrier screening. Highlight some areas for preconception planning and identify resources for learning about genetic testing, genetic counseling, and family planning. My goals for tonight are to establish some new connections with the CFLF and men with CF in general around reproductive issues, facilitate some discussion and hopefully promote generation of research questions in keeping with the CFresh model that we're sharing with the CFLF. And then hopefully also inspire attendees to reach out to their local genetic counselors and engage them in their CF care. So I want to give a little bit of background for those who have not worked with a genetic counselor before or know much about genetic counseling. It's a process of helping people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic contributions to disease. That is it's kind of a long-winded way of saying we talk to people about genetics and what it means to them. And the process of genetic counseling integrates three main components: interpretation of family and medical histories, education about genetics, inheritance, and testing and management, and then counseling, really talking to promote informed choices and any adaptation that's needed to the condition, particularly when they're around a new diagnosis. And we have some very firm tenets and principles of genetic counseling. Genetic information is key. The relationship between the genetic counselor and our clients or patients is really integral to successful genetic counseling. I highlighted patient autonomy must be supported. Today, I'm going to talk a lot about different genetic tests. I'm going to talk about medical procedures. All of this, my talk today should not imply that I would choose to do this or recommend doing any of these particular procedures or tests, but more just that they are available and something that can be explored so that people can make the decision about them that's right for them. We genetic counselors respect that patients are resilient and are able to make their own decisions, and that patient emotions make a difference in the genetic counseling process. And of course, when we think about emotionally charged issues, family planning probably is right up there with big emotionally charged decisions. Many years ago, I've been doing this a long time, actually started at the CF Care Center at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City in 1995. And one of my first areas of interest was about fathers with CF, and I presented at the Cystic Fibrosis Conference on some success stories. And I noticed there was about equal utilization of different family planning modes: adoption, artificial insemination by donor, and what was fairly new at the time, assisted reproductive technologies. And I think today, all these things are still true, plus more. There's surrogacy, there's foster care, there is choosing to be a wonderful aunt or uncle. There's so many step parenting. There's so many ways of creating a family. But today, mostly by design and invitation, I'll be talking a little bit more about the assisted reproductive technologies. And that is because assisted reproductive technology, or ART, is what's needed to address the primary issue of male infertility in cystic fibrosis, which is congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens, or CBAVD. And it is a form of what's called obstructive azoospermia. About 98% of men with CF, it's anticipated, have this type of infertility, and it is due to missing a pathway, the vas deferens, that sperm travel in order to reach the ejaculate. And CBAVD and obstructive azoospermia is not sterility. So CF does not cause sterility, but it does cause infertility. And it does not, having an absent vas deferens does not impact sexual development, sexual drive, or sexual function. But in order to have a biological child, when a person has CBAVD, the sperm needs to be retrieved from the testes or the epididymis. And there are many acronyms that are used for different procedures that can achieve this. And the A in MESA, PESA, and TESA stand for aspiration. So using a small needle to remove the sperm from either the epididymis or the testes, or extraction, which is more of a biopsy, where sperm is then extracted from the tissue from the testis that is extracted. And meeting with an experienced urologist is really important to determine which of these procedures might be right for somebody with CBAVD. And that procedure, sperm retrieval, in combination with their female partner's in vitro fertilization, or IVF, is what's used to achieve a pregnancy. And that is also a multi-step process for the partner. Includes an induction of ovulation, and that generally involves taking medications to first increase egg production so that the eggs can be retrieved either laparoscopically or transvaginally through the vagina. Step 3 is fertilization. And although sperm can be retrieved from men with cystic fibrosis, the quantities are not generally enough to do, say, artificial insemination with the retrieved sperm or intrauterine insemination. It needs an actual in the laboratory, bringing the sperm and the egg together through intracytoplasmic sperm injection, or ICSI. And then step 4 is embryo transfer, and then waiting generally about 2 weeks to see if a pregnancy is achieved. In our center, like many care centers, this really takes a team approach. So a man with CF may express an initial interest in thinking about starting a family to the physician or the nurse. Sometimes we just notice that they're coming to the center with either a new spouse or a new partner. And the medical team will do an assessment of their health and fertility status, facilitate the referral to a urologist with experience in cystic fibrosis. Generally, those relationships are pretty tight between care centers and local urologists. If you're lucky enough to live in a city where you have a lot of choices, that is wonderful, but sometimes there is somebody who's developed that particular specialty and expertise in working with men with CF. And then your medical team will provide the pulmonary clearance for the procedures. We also work closely with our social worker because there are a myriad insurance and financial issues. These are expensive procedures, and I can maybe take some questions if we have time, or I'll talk about them a little bit more at the end of this talk. But as I mentioned, this is emotionally charged, and having a caring team around you is definitely helpful to couples, both the man with CF and his partner, as they go through the process. And then I will be, as a genetic counselor, focusing more on my role today. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of genetics. Now, I spent 2 years getting a master's degree in human genetics as a genetic counselor. Anybody who's taken biology classes or genetic classes in college knows that this cannot be covered in such a short time, but I'm going to give it my best shot to set a background. Bodies are made up of cells, and every cell, and just about every cell in our body, has genetic information, which is packaged onto these structures called chromosomes. And each chromosome contains thousands of genes, which are comprised of these building block letters of DNA, the A's, C's, T's, and G's, and those spell out genetic instructions to make some kind of protein in the body. And a mutation, which is also called a variant, is a permanent difference in that DNA spelling of those genetic instructions. Not all mutations or variants cause disease. Some of them just explain why we are all different from each other. Lots of physical features, for example, hair color, hairstyle, eye color, and other physical features. And not all genetic disease is caused by a mutation or a variant in the DNA sequence. So in here we have the chromosomes of one cell. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes. The first 22 are the same for males and females by birth. And then the 23rd pair are the sex chromosomes. And so this is a male chromosomes, one X and one Y. And in this case, this person has 3 copies of chromosome 21 and has Down syndrome. The cystic fibrosis gene, the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator gene, is located on chromosome number 7. And when the CF gene is working properly, what it does is provides instructions to the body to create gates or pumps that let salt through the cell. So from the inside of the cell to the outside where the airway is. And when those pumps are not manufactured properly, or they are not working properly, or they don't get to the top of the cell where they can pump salt into the airway or into the digestive system, then water doesn't follow well, and the secretions can get thick and sticky. And that's true for the vas deferens too early on. They just don't, they either degrade very early on, even in the fetal time. So that's kind of the basic biology of the CFTR gene. Over 2,000 different genetic variants in CFTR have been identified, and about 400 have been well defined as causing cystic fibrosis. And that is according to a really wonderful database called CFTR2. I have that here for you to take a look at. The most common CFTR variant is the Delta F508 variant. About 90% of people overall in the United States are thought to have 1 or 2 copies of F508 del. Of those other 1,999 CFTR variants, some are not clearly CF causing. They may have varying clinical consequence. Some people have CF who have them, and some don't. And then some may not be associated clearly with cystic fibrosis, but those variants may be associated with what's called a CFTR-related disorder, including isolated congenital absence of the vas deferens in males. So there are men who have, say, 2 CFTR variants and don't have the full condition of cystic fibrosis, but have isolated CVABD. Other conditions associated can be newborns with 2 CFTR variants who are being monitored for symptoms. So they have something called CRMS, CF SPID, inconclusive diagnosis. Pancreatitis or chronic sinusitis are common conditions associated with CFTR differences that aren't necessarily CF causing. When we think about the inheritance of cystic fibrosis, many of us learned in high school biology or middle school biology about recessive inheritance, and that really is most clearly associated with parents of people with CF. So you've got a father who has 1 working copy of the cystic fibrosis gene noted in gray, and 1 copy that's not working properly or has a variant in it in black. And the same thing for his female partner. 1 copy of the gene is working properly and 1 is not. And so each of their children have a chance, a 25% chance to have inherited both the working copy from dad and from mom. And about 50% of the time, the child inherits a working copy from one of the parents and a non-working copy from the other parent. And they are carriers, just like their parent. And carriers are expected to be healthy. And then there's a 1 in 4 chance that both the sperm and the egg from the dad and the mom contain the non-working copy of the gene, and that person has cystic fibrosis. Just as an aside, siblings of people with cystic fibrosis who don't have CF themselves have a 2/3 chance to be a carrier and a 1/3 chance not to be a carrier. And that is because of those 4 possibilities I talked about. In that 1 in 4 chance, we know that they have 1 of 3 possibilities and not 4. So 2 of those 3 possibilities are to be a carrier, and 1 of those 3 is that they are not. So when the child with cystic fibrosis grows up to be an adult with cystic fibrosis, they start to think about possibly having a family of their own and may have questions about, you listening tonight may have questions about what is the likelihood that your children will have cystic fibrosis. And that those numbers are really dependent on the carrier status of your partner. So when the partner of a man or a person with cystic fibrosis is not a carrier, we expect that those children will inherit one non-working copy of the gene from the parent with cystic fibrosis and 1 working copy of the non-carrier parent. So all children would be expected to be CF carriers, but none would be expected to have cystic fibrosis. The caveat here, though, is that there is a bit of a disconnect or a discrepancy between having a negative carrier test and not being a carrier. So when a person does not have a family history of cystic fibrosis, which is the case for most partners of people with CF, but not all, so it's always important to take a good family history. The greatest likelihood is that they are truly not a carrier. Even when in populations where CF is most common, the carrier frequency runs about 4%. And in populations where CF is thought to be less common, it goes down to around 1% or even less than 1%. The detection rate of carrier screening also varies by population, and that is really due to the frequency of delta F508 in that population. I mentioned earlier that about 90% of people in the United States are thought to have 1 or 2 copies of the delta F508 variant, but that frequency does vary around the world. So people who come from populations that don't have a high concentration of delta F508 may have a lower detection rate, particularly if the genetic test that's being used is what we think of as a basic panel of CFTR variants. So what we do, though, is take through a Bayesian statistical analysis, which I promise I am not going to spend any time doing today on this talk, but for those of you who really like statistics, it's an interesting process. And there is a residual risk to be a carrier after a negative test result. In this chart, it is based on a 23 CFTR variant panel that includes F508del. And then, so this would be the residual risk of the partner to be a carrier after a negative test result. And then you multiply that by 1/2 to get the likelihood that the child would have cystic fibrosis. So there are different tests that are available. I'm talking a lot about the 23 variant panel, mostly because that is the minimum panel that is recommended by the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the American College of Medical Genetics. That is currently under review. So unfortunately, what I'm telling you may be a little bit out of date shortly, but it is what we've got right now. It is designed to be pan-ethnic, but as I showed you on the last slide, it definitely is better, is more sensitive in some populations than in others. There are other tests on the market that look at larger panels of CFTR variants. There's one that has about 100 variants, and they go up to more than 400 or 500 variants. And then there also are tests available that use a technique called gene sequencing, where they look at all of the CFTR variants that may have clinical consequence in the parts of the gene that are important for putting that salt pump together. It doesn't look at the entire gene, but it looks at the important parts. I kind of think of it sometimes as like a magazine, and it looks at the articles in the magazine, but not necessarily the advertisements. There's also another technique called deletion duplication analysis, which is not necessarily part of gene sequencing. But using gene sequencing, particularly with some deletion duplication analysis, increases the detection rate of CF screening from this varying rate to about 97–98% in all populations. So one question is, should partners of people with CF have CFTR screening via sequencing? And there are benefits to doing that, because using a technique that will identify not only known CF causing variants, but variants that may look like they keep the gene from working, and detect these rare disease causing variants. The screening panels may not capture them, because those are kind of curated to be to pick the more common of the variants. And so this can provide some additional reassurance to people, particularly if they are in non-Caucasian populations, or they're partners of people who are known to be carriers, or partners of people with CF. The limitation, though, is that it may detect CFTR variants that are not well known to describe, to result in CF, and that can cause a lot of stress for a couple to wonder what to do with that information and what does it mean, and the answer may be, I don't know yet. And there's no test that detects all CFTR variants. As I mentioned, sometimes there's a deletion duplication analysis that needs to be ordered separately, but even then, there's no test that's going to get you to 100%. The 97–98% I talked about is certainly an increase, but there's not a genetic test currently that we could say with certainty gives you 100% reassurance that a partner or a person is not a carrier. So the take-home points are that a negative DNA screen or a mutation panel will reduce the chances to have a child with CF or be a CF carrier, but doesn't reduce it to 100%. And we call that the residual risk. Sometimes even with these new technologies, CFTR sequencing, we don't have a clear-cut interpretation of a result, and that can be stressful for families. And sometimes not all mutations that are not clearly CF causing are always reported on prenatal screening reports. And just an aside, again, back to our siblings, relatives of people with CF definitely benefit from knowing what mutations or variants run in the family, so that they know that they can order the right test that covers the mutation in the family, so that they can have an accurate carrier screening result. So what happens if you do a test on your partner and find out that she is also a carrier of cystic fibrosis? In this case, there would be a 50% chance that the children would be a CF carrier if they inherited the working copy of the gene, and then a 50% chance for the children to have cystic fibrosis. And there are options for the situation where the partner of a person with CF is a carrier as well. One is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and that can be done after in the intracytoplasmic sperm injection. The embryo is grown to about 8 or 16 cells, and one can be tested for CF. I'm gonna see if this video works. There's also options such as donor egg and donor sperm. And also you can achieve a pregnancy and then test with prenatal diagnosis if you want to have this information before the baby is born. Options for prenatal diagnosis include chorionic villus sampling and amniocentesis, and both come with a risk of miscarriage. Also, there's also an option not to do testing and to use sonograms to monitor for meconium ileus, because we do want to make sure that there is a birth plan for a baby with CF who is expected to have meconium ileus, to make sure that they are well taken care of after they're born. And then CF newborn screening is available in all 50 states. And in our center, we make a plan to go directly to checking the DNA of the baby, instead of waiting for the first step of newborn screening, because it can just take a little bit longer. And then plan to have the family come in with the baby for a sweat test after birth. And all these things are options if the partner chooses not to have carrier screening, which is also an option for couples. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has a really wonderful website on Is Having Children Right for Me, and they go over some of the tough questions that happen before embarking on assisted reproductive technologies, because a lot of time and effort is spent planning on getting pregnant, sperm retrieval, IVF, and then you come home with a baby and life begins again. So tough questions about survivorship, the impact of parenting responsibilities on a person's CF treatment regimen, who's going to make sure that the person with CF is able to continue to take care of themselves as well as be a parent. What support systems are there for you and for your partner? What are those lifestyle changes as a result of becoming a parent? And the financial impact of, in particular, the IVF process, which is significant. I will kind of give a helpful hint, which is this is late September, and up and coming is open enrollment for insurance plans. Sometimes it's a good time if you're thinking about embarking on a urology consult and an IVF consult, to take a look at your insurance plan, see what is covered. It's hard to get it covered, but it's not impossible. Sometimes if you look at the plans offered in your workplace or your spouse's workplace, you find something that gives you a couple of tries on IVF and will cover it. You want to make sure, and I usually coordinate closely with my CF social worker colleague, because we don't want to change your insurance to cover IVF and then learn that it doesn't have as good of a prescription plan. So a lot of this planning and thought goes into all of these decisions. I hope another speaker will give a more in-depth discussion about how to pay for IVF. There's some great resources online. I have them on the next slide as well. Resolve is a really wonderful organization that has just a treasure trove of information about infertility and how to pursue family planning in the way that works for you. The CF Foundation's Compass program is also collecting resources and sharing resources about how to pay for IVF. If you want to find a genetic counselor near you, you can go to nsgc.org. I mentioned the CFTR2 website to learn more about your particular CFTR variant, and then of course, cff.org. CFresh has a wonderful website about that includes parenting, and I know that we're working on expanding that to really encompass the views of men with CF, and that is part of why we're here tonight. And I think at that, I will stop. This is where you can contact me, and I thank you so much for your time.